Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling the ongoing Israel-Palestine conflict,
Mm-hmm.
but we're really focusing specifically on Gaza on December 31st, 2024.
Okay.
And the reason I say that is because we're using a live update-style article from Al Jazeera.
Right.
So it's kind of like we're piecing together a puzzle in real time.
Yeah, what's important to remember with a source like this is that it captures a very specific moment in a very fluid situation.
Right.
It's a snapshot of a rapidly evolving story.
Exactly. And the most urgent piece of this puzzle that we're going to be looking at is the humanitarian crisis that's unfolding in Gaza.
Right.
The UN is actually accusing Israel of blocking aid,
Mm-hmm.
and tragically, another displaced Palestinian has died from hypothermia.
Oh, wow.
And to add to the dire situation, heavy rains are flooding those makeshift tent camps.
Yeah, it's a really desperate situation for families who are already displaced by the war,
Right.
having to now contend with freezing temperatures and flooded shelters.
Right.
The UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA,
Mm.
they're the ones on the ground providing aid.
Right.
They tweeted a pretty stark message saying,
Particularly-
displaced people already living through the unlivable due to the war are now battling heavy rainstorms.
It really paints a heartbreaking picture.
Yeah.
And, it's bad when they have to start evacuating patients to other countries for treatment.
Right.
The article mentions 45 sick and wounded people being sent to the UAE
Wow.
because the healthcare system in Gaza is on the verge of collapse.
The lack of adequate medical care in Gaza has been a long-standing issue.
Right.
And this recent escalation has only made things worse.
Yeah.
It really underscores that urgent need for humanitarian aid and access to proper medical facilities.
Yeah, it's a reminder that sometimes even getting basic health care becomes a struggle in conflict zones.
Absolutely.
Speaking of struggles, the article also reports a pretty disturbing incident. The Israeli army raided and cleared Kamal Adwan Hospital.
Right.
And this is the last functioning hospital in northern Gaza.
Yeah, this raises some serious concerns about the safety of medical facilities and personnel during times of war.
Yeah.
What's even more disturbing is that the hospital director, Dr. Hussam Abu Safia, was detained by Israeli forces.
Right.
And his family has no idea where he is.
Yeah, his family is terrified, and they're saying that he needs medical care himself.
Oh, wow.
And they're drawing a parallel to the death of another doctor, Dr. Iyad al-Rantisi, who died in Israeli custody earlier this year.
The UN has called for the release of all innocent civilians caught in this conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And they're really highlighting the need to protect basic human rights, even in the midst of war.
It's a stark reminder that conflict often has a ripple effect, impacting innocent lives in ways we can't always imagine.
Yeah.
And sadly, the violence extends beyond the hospital raid.
Right.
The article reports that Israeli forces killed 4 Palestinians in Jabalia
Mm-hmm.
after a day of bombings that left at least 27 dead across Gaza.
To really grasp the magnitude of this, you have to look at the bigger picture. Since this war began back on October 7th, 2023,
Mm-hmm.
the death toll is staggering. At least 45,541 Palestinians killed and over 108,000 wounded.
And it's important to acknowledge the loss of life on the Israeli side as well.
Absolutely.
The attacks by Hamas on that same day, October 7th, resulted in 11,139 people killed in Israel, with more than 200 taken captive.
It's a tragedy on all sides.
Yeah.
A reminder of the devastating human cost of this conflict.
Yeah, and it doesn't stop there.
Right?
The article also mentions Israeli army raids in the West Bank town of Tulkarem, showing how this conflict spills over into different areas.
It's like trying to contain a wildfire. The flames just keep spreading.
Yeah, and as if things weren't complex enough, we have international involvement adding fuel to the fire.
Right.
The article mentions the U.S. Army claiming responsibility for airstrikes on Houthi targets in Yemen.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
The Houthis are claiming these strikes were in retaliation for Israel's actions in Gaza, which, if you remember, ties back to that Houthi missile attack on Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
The Israeli army claims they intercepted the missile, but it shows how quickly this conflict can draw in other actors.
It's like a chain reaction.
Yeah.
You know what else caught my eye?
What's that?
The article mentions the Lebanese army moving into a southern town called Shama
Right.
after an Israeli withdrawal.
That withdrawal was supposed to be temporary, just 60 days, starting back in November.
Right.
But there are already hints that the Israeli army might stay in Lebanon even longer.
Wow.
This just adds another layer of uncertainty and potential for future conflict in the region.
Yeah, it's clear this situation has far-reaching consequences impacting lives far beyond the immediate borders of Israel and Palestine.
Absolutely. Conflicts rarely exist in isolation. There are always interconnected political and strategic dynamics at play.
Yeah, and sadly caught in the crosshairs of this conflict are the journalists trying to report on it. The article highlights the incredibly dangerous conditions they face, pointing out that 217 journalists and media workers have been killed since this war started.
And that number keeps growing.
Oh, wow.
Just a few days ago, on December 26th, 5 more journalists were killed in an airstrike that hit their news van near Al-Auda Hospital.
Oh, my gosh.
Al Jazeera actually has a tribute page listing the names of all the journalists killed.
Really?
It's a stark reminder of the risks they take to bring us the news.
It's heartbreaking, and it makes you realize that even those trying to document the conflict aren't immune to the violence.
Their deaths underscore just how important a free and independent press is, especially in places like Gaza.
Right.
These journalists are risking their lives to keep us informed and to hold those in power accountable.
So we've got this humanitarian crisis unfolding, escalating violence, and international players getting involved. Where do we even go from here?
Well, to understand what's happening now, we need to rewind a bit.
And look at the bigger picture. Let's dive into the historical context of the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Great idea. That's where we'll pick up in part 2 of this deep dive.
So picking up where we left off, you can't really understand what's happening in Gaza today without some historical context.
Okay.
The Israel-Palestine conflict is deeply rooted in competing claims to the same land,
Right.
with both sides having historical, religious, and cultural ties to the region.
That makes sense. It's not just a recent flare-up, right?
Exactly. For over a century, there's been this cycle of violence, displacement, and failed peace negotiations.
Right.
It's a complex web of political, social, and religious factors that are incredibly difficult to untangle.
So how did this specific war start?
Okay.
The one that began in October 2023.
Right.
The article mentioned that date a lot.
Well, on October 7th, 2023, Hamas, the Palestinian militant group that controls Gaza, launched a large-scale surprise attack on Israel.
Right.
It was a major escalation that caught many off guard, and Israel responded with a massive military offensive on Gaza. The article mentioned a high number of casualties even before these recent events in December.
Right.
Is that because of the initial fighting in October?
Yes, that initial fighting was incredibly intense and resulted in a heavy loss of life on both sides.
Right.
And the conflict has been raging ever since.
Wow.
With periods of intense fighting interspersed with attempts at ceasefires, which, as we've seen, have been largely unsuccessful.
So the fighting continues. Back to the present. There's a pretty striking detail in the article about the situation in Khan Yunis, a city in southern Gaza.
Right. The UNRWA, remember, they're the ones providing aid to Palestinian refugees. They reported that over 100 tents housing displaced families were flooded due to those heavy rains we talked about.
Wow, that's awful. They were already displaced, and now they're dealing with freezing temperatures and flooding.
It's a dire situation, and there are about 500 families living right along the Gaza shoreline.
Oh, wow.
Extremely vulnerable to the strong winds and waves. UNRWA is really stressing the need for more consistent humanitarian aid to reach these people, especially as winter sets in.
This brings us back to that whole issue of aid access.
Yeah.
And the UN's accusations that Israel's blocking it. What are the implications of that?
Well, on a practical level, it means people in Gaza are struggling to get the basic necessities they need to survive.
Right.
Food, water, shelter, medical supplies. But it also has wider political implications.
Okay.
The UN's accusation puts pressure on Israel to allow aid into Gaza, and it highlights the humanitarian cost of the conflict on the international stage.
It seems like there are so many layers to this conflict.
Yeah.
The fighting the humanitarian crisis, and then all these political and legal issues as well.
Absolutely. And one of those legal issues that caught my attention is this detail about Israel repeatedly asking to delay a Supreme Court hearing on Red Cross prisonal visits.
Yeah, what's that about? I saw that in the article, but didn't really understand it.
So the Red Cross has been trying to get access to Palestinian prisoners being held in Israel. They filed a petition with the Israeli Supreme Court.
Right.
And this hearing was supposed to address that petition.
Right.
But Israel has asked for a delay. This is actually the 6th time they've done so.
Why would they keep delaying it?
It's hard to say for sure, but it raises some questions about transparency and accountability within the Israeli detention system.
Okay.
The Red Cross plays a vital role in ensuring that prisoners are treated humanely,
Right.
regardless of their alleged crimes, and their access is especially important in conflict zones where there are concerns about potential human rights abuses.
So delaying the hearing could be seen as an attempt to avoid scrutiny.
Potentially,
Yeah.
yes. And it also prolongs the anxiety and uncertainty for the families of those prisoners who are desperate for information about their loved ones.
It's like another layer of suffering on top of everything else.
Yeah.
And while we're talking about suffering, the article also mentions the economic impact of this conflict, which is something we haven't really touched on yet.
It's a crucial aspect to consider. The Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics reported that Gaza has lost about 6% of its population since the fighting began in October 2023.
6%.
That's huge.
It really is. And it's not just about people being killed or injured in the fighting.
Right.
It's also about people fleeing the region because of the violence,
Right.
the lack of opportunities, the destruction.
Right.
This mass displacement will have long-term consequences for Gaza's economy and its ability to recover.
So we've got this massive humanitarian crisis, an escalating conflict, and now a shrinking population and a devastated economy. It's just a wave of bad news.
It's a bleak picture for sure. And what's frustrating is that there still seems to be this stalemate, this back and forth of accusations with no clear path towards a resolution.
Right. I remember reading something in the article about Israel claiming that Hamas is using hospitals for military purposes.
Yes, and that's a serious accusation.
Yeah.
But a recent UN Human Rights Office report found that Israel's evidence to support these claims has been vague
Okay.
and sometimes contradicted by publicly available information. So it's basically their word against Hamas's.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
And what makes it even more concerning is that despite the lack of clear evidence, Israeli attacks on hospitals have continued with devastating consequences for Gaza's healthcare system.
Right.
The UN report really highlights the vulnerability of civilians and the difficulty of ensuring their safety and access to essential services in a conflict zone.
This whole situation feels so overwhelming.
It is. But even amidst all the despair, there are voices calling for peace and justice.
Okay.
The article quotes Mansour Shoman, a Palestinian journalist and humanitarian worker, who describes the situation in Gaza as a genocide and a scar on the modern world.
Oh.
His words are a stark reminder of the human cost of this conflict and the urgency of finding a solution.
He's right. The international community can't just stand by and watch this unfold. What can be done?
Well, that's a complex question with no easy answers, right? But one thing is clear, the current approach isn't working. Well, we've seen repeated attempts at ceasefires, but they haven't held. There's a lack of trust between the two sides and a reluctance to make the compromises necessary for a lasting peace.
Okay.
The international community needs to play a more active role in mediating this conflict,
Right.
but they also need to hold both sides accountable for their actions.
It sounds like there are no quick fixes here.
No, definitely not. This conflict has been going on for decades.
Right.
And it's intertwined with so many complex historical, political, and religious issues.
It feels like we've only scratched the surface here.
We have, and that's important to acknowledge.
Right.
Understanding the Israel-Palestine conflict requires a willingness to delve deeper, to go beyond the headlines and the simplistic narratives.
Right.
There are so many different perspectives, so many layers of history and trauma to consider.
So where do we go from here?
Well, I think the most important thing is to continue learning, continue asking questions, and continue engaging with this issue in a thoughtful and informed way.
Okay, so we're back, and it feels like we've covered so much ground.
We have, but you know, it's just a glimpse into this very complex issue. There's always more to learn.
Right, and as we continue to learn and explore, it's crucial to remember the human cost of this conflict.
Absolutely.
And I think the article we've been discussing does a great job of highlighting that human cost through those individual stories that it shares.
Yeah.
Like the story of Dr. Hussam Abu Safia,
Right.
the hospital director who was detained by Israeli forces.
His story is particularly poignant because it highlights that fear and uncertainty that so many Palestinians are facing right now.
Right.
You know, his family is desperate for news, worried about his well-being, and drawing parallels to the death of Dr. Iyad al-Rantisi earlier this year. It's a stark reminder that even those in positions of authority are vulnerable in a conflict zone.
And the article also mentions that the Palestinian Prisoners Society is demanding Dr. Abu Safia's release.
Right.
And they're highlighting the larger issue of Israeli detentions, pointing out that thousands of Palestinians, including hundreds of children, have been arrested this year.
This raises serious questions about due process and fair trials.
Right.
Are these detentions justified? Are people being held without sufficient evidence?
Hmm.
These are issues that need to be addressed, and the international community has a responsibility to ensure that those basic human rights are being upheld,
Right.
even in the midst of conflict.
It seems like every aspect of this conflict is intertwined with complex legal and humanitarian issues.
It is, and that's why it's so important to move beyond those simplistic narratives and really grapple with the complexities.
And the article also mentions that despite the ongoing war, there's still sporadic rocket fire from Gaza, and Israeli politicians are being criticized for not being able to stop these attacks.
Right.
It feels like even with all the military might involved, there's no easy solution.
That's the paradox of this conflict. Military solutions haven't brought peace, and in fact, they often exacerbate the cycle of violence and mistrust. What's needed is a political solution, one that addresses the root causes of the conflict and recognizes the legitimate grievances of both sides.
We talked earlier about the regional dynamics at play with actors like the Houthis in Yemen becoming involved.
Right, and the article reminds us of that connection by mentioning the U.S. airstrikes on Houthi targets in Yemen, which the Houthis claim were in retaliation for Israel's actions in Gaza.
Right.
This interconnectedness highlights the need for a broader regional approach to peace, one that recognizes the interplay of various conflicts and actors in the Middle East.
It's like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle without all the pieces.
Exactly, and sometimes those missing pieces are the most crucial ones.
The article's photos of displaced Palestinian children trying to navigate flooded streets and make do in their damaged tents were truly heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder that children often bear the brunt of conflicts they had no part in creating.
Their resilience is remarkable, but it's a tragic indictment of our collective failure to find a lasting solution to this conflict. These children deserve to grow up in peace and security, not in fear and uncertainty.
I keep thinking back to that quote from Mansour Shoman. What is happening is a genocide and a scar on the modern world.
Right.
It's a powerful statement that challenges us to confront the gravity of the situation.
His words shouldn't be taken lightly. They're a call to action for the international community to break its silence and to actively work towards a just and sustainable peace.
So where does that leave us? What can we as individuals do to contribute to a more peaceful future for Israelis and Palestinians?
It starts with education. Take the time to learn about the history of the conflict, the different narratives, the perspectives of all sides involved.
Okay.
Engage in thoughtful discussions, challenge your own assumptions, and be open to hearing different viewpoints.
It sounds like it's about becoming more informed and engaged citizens.
Exactly. Support organizations working on the ground to provide humanitarian aid and promote peace-building initiatives. Hold your elected officials accountable for their actions and policies related to the conflict.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to the complexity of this issue.
It has.
But it's also left me with a sense of hope.
Me too.
There are people working tirelessly to make a difference.
Absolutely.
And we can all play a part in creating a more just and peaceful world.
I agree. Change starts with awareness, understanding, and a commitment to action.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive.
It has.
But it feels like the conversation is far from over.
It never really is. This is an ongoing issue that demands our continued attention and engagement.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Yes, thank you for listening.
We encourage you to continue exploring this complex issue, seeking out diverse perspectives, and forming your own informed opinions.
Remember, knowledge is power, and understanding is the first step towards positive change.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.